All right, guys, we're going to get the program started. Again, I introduced myself earlier, Lee Bratch. I'm the president of Texas Blockchain Council. It's my pleasure to introduce our next panel. We have the need for more concerted political action. And so at this point, we've got Mandy, Gunasekara, and Dennis Porter coming to the stage to make a big announcement. Also, I just want to say it's been a pleasure to get to work with these two fine public servants. Mandy has worked in several administrations in D.C. and in the private sector. Dennis, if you're not following Dennis on Twitter, you're missing out. He's, I would call him a Bitcoin influencer. He works a lot with elected officials in different states across the country. Has been a great voice for Bitcoin mining, and that's the nature of the discussion that they will have with you in just a moment. So join me in welcoming them to the stage.
How's everybody doing? Big round of applause to John, both Johns, Big Johns, for putting on this event. Thank you, John. Stand up. John, stand up. The relationships that are built here are going to carry over for a very long time, so thank you for putting this event on and inviting me and Mandy to come chat with you about this new organization that we have launched officially this week called Satoshi Action Fund. As all of you know, Bitcoin miners have been under attack all across the world. In the EU, they're attempting to ban it. New York, they're regulating the end use of electricity. In China, they kicked the miners out. And the Biden administration is most definitely moving the wrong direction on this issue. It's something that I'm highly concerned about. And I'm also concerned about the fact that it has put us on defense. Defense is good. You know, defense wins champions, as they say, championships. But it's important to also go on offense. You know, the analogy I like to give is, if you're playing a game of soccer, I chose this photo for a reason, and you're all just standing around the goal the whole time, that's it, just playing defense, you will probably prevent your opponent from scoring very many goals, but you also won't score any of your own, no points, which means you'll never win a single match, which means, given enough time, you will lose this battle, you'll lose this war. This is why Satoshi Action Fund was created, to go on the offensive for Bitcoin miners by first, through phase one, educating policymakers. We want to get in front of state lawmakers and help them to understand the value of attracting this nascent tech infrastructure to their state. And then number two, we'll be lobbying for effective policy. So all the great things that you see here in the great state of Texas and all the work that Lee Bratcher is doing with the TBC to make it even better, we want to expand that. We want to expand Texas policy across the entire country so that other states can partake in programs like the Demand Response Incentive Program, so that we can create tax breaks for miners. Because this industry brings jobs, it brings investment, it brings innovation to states all across the country and has the potential to do that. And we want policymakers to understand that story. We also want them to understand the positive story around energy and the fact that Bitcoin mining helps on both sides. It's pro-energy, and if you like renewables, it helps to soak up all that excess load, right? Phase three, if necessary, which it probably will be, we'll be going on the offensive by electing pro-Bitcoin mining candidates. Not only on the state side, yeah, I think there's a ton of work going on the federal side. It's great. And for instance, there's great organizations out there doing great work. Digital Chamber, Blockchain Association, lots of other folks popping up. But we want to get involved in local races, state races, and also public utility commissioner races in certain target states where we can be the most effective, have the highest ROI possible. Phase one, we'll be educating policymakers through our personal connections. As Mandy stated, you know, she's worked in and out of policy in DC and on the state level for over a decade. The rest of our team have a combined amount of time of over 30 years of working in the political arena. So we'll also be doing conferences, attending conferences like this to talk to miners, to let them know about the organization is important so you can get involved. But we'll also be going to state policymaker conferences. There's one just next month called ALEC, and there's one later in September called the State Policy Network. And we can go there and directly educate lawmakers on the impact that this nascent tech infrastructure can have in their state. We'll also be doing live Zoom courses, just mass educate, mass educate, mass educate. The premise is this is like, if you get 100 state policymakers who are listening to you, maybe 50 of them will actually agree with you. Maybe 25 of them will actually make an effort. Maybe 5 of those will be serious. And maybe 2 of them will actually go forward and do something. So if 2 states in this country become a lot more like Texas and a lot less like New York, I think that's a positive thing that can happen here in the USA. So that's the premise. Mass educate, turn back around, hand them model legislation. We want to become the hub for state action on the lobbying front. We're making connections all across the country with state lobbying efforts. If you know any local lobbyists that are highly focused on Bitcoin, Bitcoin mining policy, please have them reach out to us. We're really interested in connecting with them. Phase 3, build the bench. Get deeply involved in getting pro-Bitcoin mining candidates elected at the state level. That's good for state policy, right? Energy policy. It happens at the state level predominantly, but also the folks that go on to win these seats can become future congressmen. They can become future senators, and one day I believe they will become a pro-Bitcoin mining president in the United States. We'll start local, as I said, local races, local. Why? Because there's a lot less competition in and around these races. There's a lot less money involved in these races. And so we have a real chance to build relationships with people on the ground, get them elected, and as the time goes on, they will always remember the folks that were there for them in the very beginning. It's all about long-term relationships. All of you know in business and in politics, too, it's the same. These long-term relationships can carry us forward into the next decade. But we are in a war. Time is running out. And I don't say that lightly. I have conversations with a lot of different people that are very pro-Bitcoin, people that are very anti-Bitcoin. And if it wasn't for the fact that we have elections, I can guarantee you that this current administration and one in the future will come down very heavily on Bitcoin mining, not just because of the energy problem, right? The energy uses too much energy. We all know that's BS, right? Skip to the next one, there we go. The main reason really is control, right? They can't control Bitcoin. They can't control Bitcoin mining. And so they're going to come down on this industry. I think it would have already happened by now if they weren't faced with the fact that they could get unseated through elections. But there's always an opportunity and a chance for them to do it when they're in a powerful political position. Time is running out. The Biden EO is coming. The reports are coming. They've done their analysis. They've done the reporting. The people in this administration, for instance, that are working on these, we have some allies in there. We're very, very fortunate to have some allies. But there are Warren staffers that are trying to figure out how they can shut this industry down that work in the Biden administration. So we have to be very careful. This is what they've tried before. Again, New York bill, China ban, EU proposal, Biden EO. In just Washington state, just last week, they raised the rates on Bitcoin miners. What other industry do you know where they just literally target that industry? They're starting to regulate the end use of electricity. In my personal opinion, I believe eventually what will happen is the EPA will get involved with regulating the end use of electricity, which is a Pandora's box for unfeathered power when it comes to deciding when and where and how you can use your electricity. So that's pretty much it. Satoshi Action Fund is here to go on the offensive for you, Bitcoin miners, to make sure that we're not just on defense all the time. We got to start going on offense, start winning these small battles so that when we can carry ourselves forward through the next decade and win even bigger and bigger battles and eventually have a major impact on the federal side. So if you're interested in getting involved, come find me. We are looking for endorsers. We are looking for people to get onto our committees. We're also obviously looking for money as well, and would be happy to have you join Satoshi Action Fund. If I so inspired you enough today to donate today, please do so. We all understand the tight market we live in, but we are not going to be using this money in an irresponsible way. We will be very actively going to these state policymakers and making sure that we turn them in the right direction with regards to Bitcoin mining. Is that it for me? That's it for me. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you letting me come in front of you and give you this talk. Mandy, Mike, do you want this mic or you want that mic? Mandy Gunasekara is my co-founder, and she's going to be talking a little bit about some of her experience, having been the former chief of staff of the EPA and worked in policy for over a decade.
Yeah, happy to. And I will pick right up where Dennis left off. I'm very excited to be here with you and excited to officially be with Dennis for the launch of Satoshi Action Fund. It's something we've been working on for a really long time. And it's interesting, our relationship started, I am a backup guest host for one of our statewide radio shows in Mississippi, which is where I call home. And I've been trying to orange pill the state of Mississippi. And I invited Dennis to be a guest, and we hit it off really well and then started talking and realized we were on the same wavelength with regard to looking at the landscape of nonprofits and political activists and organizations that have popped up in support of cryptocurrency in general, Bitcoin in some instances, but we saw a gap. Specifically with regard to Bitcoin mining, there was no one who was exclusively focused to expanding the role of Bitcoin mining, looking to energy opportunities, favorable tax treatment, and really building something up from the ground level. Now, I spent my career in Washington, D.C. I grew up, so to speak, bouncing back and forth between the U.S. House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, and landed a position, 2 positions, in the Trump administration. The first one I loved, the second one not so much, but a lot of that had to do with the fact that the day I started as Chief of Staff was also the day the federal government shut down because of COVID. And so my vision of what I was going to be doing to fulfill the President's vision in the context of balanced environmental regulation to achieve and support larger economic goals was quickly shifted to figuring out how our 14,000 workforce among 10 different regional offices and 11 different offices housed in D.C. was going to continue to function and operate and fulfill a very important mission, which is to protect the environment and support and promote public health. Now, not to say that the current EPA is acting in the way that I would want it to. Unfortunately, there are political forces at play that co-opt good ideas and use them to achieve political ends. And the experience I've had dealing with that from the inside is something that I want to make sure isn't repeated in the Bitcoin mining space. And so what we're really going to exclusively focus on is making America a celebrated Bitcoin mining destination. We want to expand the Texas and we want to limit the New York. And the good news is there's a lot of tools that we have at our disposal, but beyond the tools, we have some really great people that we're already working with. Obviously, many of you know Dennis. He's a really important, well-informed influencer that has been around for a long time, well-respected, great following. And then on the DC side, this is where myself as a co-founder and my husband, Surya, who's also a co-founder, he spent his career in Washington, DC as well, working at the Department of Energy, was slated to go over to the National Security Council, but we lost an election in the process, but served time in the political side of the equation as a chief of staff on Capitol Hill. But between us and then our advisory board, we have 3 individuals. One is a good friend of ours who has had leadership positions on the Democrat side of the aisle. We're heavily Republican, but we do have Democrat friends. Despite what you may read in the media, there's a lot of us that get along and have worked together. Here's just one example. When I worked in the U.S. Senate, I often went to international climate conferences, and I became really good friends with Bernie Sanders' climate advisor, and she and I actually still keep in touch. So there's ways for folks that come and look at issues from a totally different perspective to, 1, get along, and then 2, to find ways to work together. And I think therein lies the opportunity with Bitcoin, because and especially the mining space, the lines are drawn really not from Republican and Democrat, but by how people view freedom, whether they view freedom as something that should be celebrated and expanded or something that should be limited and they don't trust. And unfortunately, the current administration takes the latter view, but we've got folks who are of the Democrat Party who are working with us. They see freedom as something to be celebrated in the context of Bitcoin. They understand the benefits it brings, and they also understand, as Dennis rightfully said, that a lot of the energy discussion, it's just a distraction. It's an absolute distraction, but just because it's a distraction doesn't mean that it is not a viable threat to the ability to expand Bitcoin mining throughout the United States. So that's what we're going to be working on and focusing on. And a big part of that, too, is setting the narrative. In my time at EPA and on Capitol Hill, I worked a lot with the oil and gas industry. I feel like that's a part of my natural attraction to the Bitcoin mining space. But there's a lesson to be learned about where our traditional energy resources are viewed today. We have to defend, and those that are directly a part of the industry have to defend the fact that we have a low-cost, reliable, abundant source of energy that's created these massive societal benefits. We have to defend that as a good thing today because of the way that the narrative has been set by activists that want to limit, deter, and undercut their relative success. There's lessons to be learned because what the energy industry did, and in part because they didn't necessarily see it coming, they dismissed critics who now are in positions of significant influence, some of the deciders in the policy space. And they also were busy doing what they do best, which is building their businesses, extracting, refining, transporting, and delivering much needed commodities to the market, but they didn't realize and treat the threats to their industry coming from the political landscape in the ways that they should have, and now they're dealing with the current situation. So that's something we can avoid, and the best thing to do is for us to set the narrative and for us to tell the very good stories that Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining in particular has to offer. And there's two of these stories I just want to highlight, and one of them is the role of rural revitalization. I'm from a small town in Mississippi. There are 800 residents that live within the city proper, and then about 1,200 if you expand out a little bit more in the surrounding area. But I've often, and there's a lot of these little towns, especially in Mississippi, I've gone into these areas and you see these main streets, but they're dilapidated. Nobody's going there. There's not these businesses. And I've often thought, what could we do? There's the bones of a prosperous past. What could we do to bring that back up in the here and now? And I always thought, like, if only there were a technology to where you could integrate modern technology into existing infrastructure and space that exists in rural America, that would be the perfect solution. And enter Bitcoin. I first learned about Bitcoin mining when I was doing a little bit of a research project and ultimately ended up invested in one that's based out of Wyoming. But it is the perfect solution to rural revitalization because it's private sector led. You don't necessarily need the federal government to get it underway. Now you do need permits and you need access to power, but in a place like Mississippi and a lot of rural places, you have three really important characteristics. You have loyal, hardworking people that with the proper training they're going to be proud of what they do and they're going to do a good job. You have cheap, reliable energy, generally speaking, and you have a lot of land or empty spaces. And so there's so many little towns to where if we could just expand out the opportunities for Bitcoin mining and incentivize people to come into those areas, you can really change these communities and lift them up in ways that they have not thought about for probably generations. And the second good news story is the environmental space. So let's talk about methane capture. When I was at the EPA, I served 2 stints there. My first one was in more of a technical role. I was in our Office of Air and Radiation. And one of the regulations we had to work on, now I could have a whole conversation with you about whether or not we should have been regulating it, but the regulatory system I had inherited was we were regulating certain aspects of the oil and gas industry aimed at reducing methane emissions. We spent 4 years working on a technical package to fix some of the problems that it just didn't work. It wasn't feasible. But we spent 4 years trying to develop a rule that could work, could actually reduce some emissions, and then ultimately was sent to the states for final implementation. Bitcoin, it's a technology that is immensely deployable, transportable, that can go in and capture those methane emissions from all manner of either the chain of operation or in some of these abandoned wells that are leaking, can capture that methane and turn it into something valuable for the people who are doing it, because cost is always a big barrier in terms of pushing environmental improvements from the regulator perspective. Cost isn't an issue because you're going to generate value not only for the people who are doing it, but then also for the broader societal good that Bitcoin mining brings to the equation. So Bitcoin mining is the perfect solution to so many different goals. I believe strongly in its potential for rural revitalization, being a solution for a range of environmental improvements and relative goals. And we are going to be working at Satoshi Action Fund to ensure that we expand policies from the ground up so we can make America a celebrated Bitcoin mining destination that we know it can be. So thank you, and we're happy to take questions if you have any.
Have questions, but if you have any, feel free to raise your hand. Mic to be passed around. We're going to be actively engaged on the state level, so it's going to be a really interesting fight ahead of us, and I'm very excited to be working alongside Mandy. You know, as someone who's a Bitcoiner and is just highly focused on and obsessed with Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, I wanted to make sure that my home country, I knew I wasn't going to be fleeing anywhere. I know there's always this stories like, oh, I'll just take my Bitcoin and leave. I'm like, yeah, I'll just sell my businesses and my house, and I'll just, like, you know, move my kid to a different school and my mother-in-law that lives below me. So I decided, I woke up one day, realized that was a fantasy. I'm not going anywhere, staying right here in the United States. And because of that, I know the importance, because I value Bitcoin mining so greatly, I wanted to make sure the United States was the best place to mine, sell, buy, hodl Bitcoin, all the above, but especially this nascent tech infrastructure. Was there a question?
Yeah, Mandy, Dennis, thank you very much for the work you're doing. It's fantastic. Can you talk about like where are you at in the process? Is this like, are we on like at home plate, or have we taken a couple steps past home plate, and sort of what kind of foundation has been put together so far?
So we have started to receive funding. We're in fundraising mode. We've also, as you know, established this is our outline of our strategy. We have a much more granular level strategy. So if you are a Bitcoin miner wondering, like, okay, well, what are they actually going to do? How are they actually going to get this done? Happy to have one-on-one conversations with you to share the very specifics on the strategy and the approach that we're taking. But we have officially organized. We are officially receiving money, and we've been talking to some of the largest publicly traded mining companies. And also, I made it a key initiative of mine to not just focus on the large miners, but also include the small to medium-sized miners, because I find them as a vital infrastructural part of the Bitcoin network and to help avoid centralization. And that's why I was so excited that John had us here to speak today. Any other questions? Pump Jack, let's go. Get your power from Pump Jack. He's going to mic you up.
How do you think, obviously we live in a world of extreme political views. Dennis, how do you view Bitcoin bringing both sides to kind of come to the middle and to kind of find reason?
That is a really, really important question, because we live in an extremely divisive time, and there's just so little that we agree with each other on both sides of the aisle. And for the first time ever in my work in policy and also on the political side campaigning, I found an issue where both sides agree. And not only do they agree on Bitcoin, I find Democrats, I find Republicans. Listen, I'm talking to Senator Ron Wyden and I'm talking to Senator Lummis, and they both have Bitcoin in common. They both like Bitcoin, moving in the right direction. Obviously, Senator Lummis much more forward on the issue, and we're really thankful for her leadership. But as time goes on, I think that you're going to see more and more Democrats come forward on this issue as they realize that Bitcoin is great, not only for equality and accessibility to financial services to the 10 million people in this country who do not have a bank account, but also they love the innovation aspect of Bitcoin. Some of you may not believe that, but a lot of times when I talk to Democrats, that's one of the big things they bring up. They really love the innovation in and around this thing. So it's critical that we maintain that both sides of the conversation. The thing I like to say is, like, okay, if we make this a partisan issue, which some people in this space are interested in that, most of them are not, fortunately. Few are. At the end of the day, if you make it a partisan issue, you'll be spending 50% of your time, moving the ball forward, and you'll be spending 50% of your time like fighting against an attack, fighting against the pushback. Because on average, right, maybe it's a little 40-60 sometimes, there's someone going to be in power that you disagree with. So that's why I want to make sure that Bitcoin stays a bipartisan or nonpartisan issue is the one way that most people like to describe it, so that we can be spending time 100% of the time moving the ball forward. But yeah, I don't know if you want to touch on that at all, Mandy, the bipartisan aspect.
I would add to that. I mean, that's why the education component is hugely important. And if you're going to Washington, D.C. to talk to members, you need to educate them and make sure, one, you're aware of their priorities and how our relative goals help them achieve those priorities. And the thing about Bitcoin, it has so many different applications and can be used to help achieve so many different goals that's fairly easy to do. So it's getting in front of them, it's educating them, but then also this is where our local and state focus becomes really important, because proving out concepts at the state and local level also influences whether it's DC representatives or federal-based agencies, what they look to inform how they are going about interpreting or applying an issue. So I think it's education, it's continuing to keep it nonpartisan, and then proving out how Bitcoin can be a force for good at the state and local level that they can then look at and use to inform the policy decisions that they're making.
And one last thing there too, like with regards to the mining too, because I talked about Bitcoin, but Bitcoin mining, despite the misinformation around it and the misconceptions, it is also bipartisan. It is also nonpartisan, because for the first time ever, oddly enough, you have the pro-energy people and the pro-environment people working towards the same goal. Because as everyone in this room knows, Bitcoin mining is incredibly valuable when it comes to renewable energy assets and the ability to soak up excess load. When you tell a Democrat that and you tell them that they get ROI on renewable energy assets, when you tell environmentalists that, I mean, I talk to environmentalists, I talk to climate researchers, and they are like, we need Bitcoin mining, and they're just doing everything they can to educate people on their side of the aisle. And this is unique. Like, when have you ever had the energy people, pro-energy, like, doesn't matter what it is, pro-energy, and I only care about the climate people on the same team? And that, I think, is almost bigger than Democrat versus Republican. Anyone else?
Yeah, one quick question for you. And you just talked about this a little bit, but so people here, number one takeaway, what are we doing when we go home and we're chatting with our friends and all that stuff? What's the message what's the easiest message, low-hanging fruit, value proposition that you think is effective and you're seeing traction with?
With regards to policy?
Yeah, whatever. It's like, what like if you could tell us to tell our friends and our some people here are involved in politics, maybe, so that's that conversation, but like what's the one message that you think is the most effective that people need to know that they don't understand?
I mean, it's definitely the energy aspect of Bitcoin. The energy conversation is critical, because when you talk to normal people, that's really almost all they hear. They just hear that Bitcoin uses too much energy. So dispelling that narrative is really important for the education. Just broadly, education around Bitcoin is really important, and try to find people who are willing to listen. Like, don't waste your time, pounding your head against a brick wall. Like, if people aren't interested in hearing what you have to say, like, move on to the next person. There are a lot of people out there that are interested, and that's going back to kind of our approach. And again, we can get into a granular level of like which states we're going to be targeting the most, but they tend to be states that Bitcoin miners want to go to. There's a reason we want to go to them, and it's because they are ready and willing to have the conversation around Bitcoin mining, and they are ready and willing to pass legislation around Bitcoin mining because they want to attract the jobs, the investment, and the innovation to their state. So that's low-hanging fruit, so to speak, for those states. Do the same thing with your friends and family. Like, if you find someone that is just like, tell me more, like, jump into that conversation, educate them, not just because of that individual person, but because that person might orange pill, I don't know, they might be the nephew of a senator, or you don't really know for sure. For instance, Senator Lummis's son-in-law was the reason why she first learned about Bitcoin. So you don't know who you're going to have an impact on, 2 to 3 degrees of separation. So that's really, really big when it comes to interacting with folks, is trying to just dispel that energy narrative as quickly as possible. And then also at the same time telling them the benefit of Bitcoin, because you want to show the value while also dispelling the misconceptions around Bitcoin as well.
Yeah, that miners are making possible expanded access to financial stability that a lot of people never dreamed of having access to, and we can do it in a way that generates jobs and opportunities in places in this country that, they're the forgotten communities that people have left behind. So those two components are good opening narratives and takeaways from the benefits of Bitcoin mining, because Bitcoin mining makes that possible, which creates global benefits as well as domestic benefits in the form of the jobs, economic prosperity.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did.
Enough.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Over, Kevin, what's up, man? Use Foundry Pool.
Once again, great effort, great presentation too. As a Western New York-based mining services company, we know the repercussions of ignorant and misinformed policy, obviously. My question is, ever since the infrastructure bill, I think the industry has really stepped up. Everyone's been hiring external affairs, public policy experts within their company. My question is, what's the strategy or the plan for coordinating between all the new talent and all the resources within our space, right? There's a lot of new organizations that have launched. What's the strategy for getting aligned with the message and with kind of the efforts around Bitcoin mining?
Yeah, I'll start with this. I would say there's an inherent coordination because a lot of the people, at least in the DC-based institutions, are folks that myself or my husband have worked with in the past. For example, at the Chamber of Digital Commerce, Tom Mapes, who's in charge of the mining initiative, we worked in the Trump administration together. He was at the Department of Energy. And so there's a lot of that because at the end of the day, a place like DC is a relatively small community of folks. So there's inherent coordination just because of the relationships we have that we've been working with them. And then also I would say this, what we tell our folks is to look at us as an additional tool, one where we're exclusively focused on Bitcoin mining, but then we're also working from the local level up, and we can liaison with them what we see on the ground when we're talking to the practitioners out in the field, what they care about, to make sure that we're coordinated. And the reason that's relatively easy is because between my husband and I, we have 20 years of experience in DC, so we know a lot of these folks because we worked with them in other applications in other areas. Dennis, would you add?
And like on the other side of the aisle, when it comes to what you're discussing, I mean, you're saying like we know the DC people, like I know all the Bitcoin people. Like anybody that's doing anything in Bitcoin knows who I am, and I know who they are, and we're having conversations. So I engage with all of the new startup organizations, and have had conversations with them. I think communication could be better for sure, but also with regards to the Digital Chamber and the Blockchain Association, like they're doing great work. But again, this is kind of going back to what Mandy was saying with regards to like where you're being effective at. And most of these organizations are highly focused in DC. Going back to my talk earlier around defense versus offense, we are kind of forced to go to DC to play this defensive game. There's some offensive efforts being done with regards to other industries. You know, you see the Lummis bill, and you see what Gillibrand and Lummis are doing together, but there's no one extremely hyper-focused on Bitcoin mining. And the main way that we can be hyper-focused on Bitcoin mining and be effective is to go to the state level, because that's where a lot of energy policy is set, and that's where the low-hanging fruit is. Again, like DC, you want to get involved in that game, there's a lot of power brokers in DC, and there's a lot of money. It's $10 million for a congressional race. It's $100 million for a Senate race. And then maybe when they get there as a brand new freshman in Congress, they can maybe make a couple alliances, but they're not going to get any bills passed for years. Like we can go to state by state to places where they're already ready and willing to get on board with this new industry, especially because they don't have to ask DC. They don't have to ask the federal government for permission to move in the right direction, and we can just start being effective on day one. But I do agree that there is a lot of new startup political organizations. There's a lot of older ones that have been around for a long time. I'm close to Perry Ann Boring. I talk a lot with Kristen Smith, leading those organizations well. There are open lines of communication. Maybe it's just not in a very super public way. But I think that it's important to always have as much communication as possible between the organizations.
So what's your best guess as to what the Biden administration may or may not do, and the impact of that? And then is regulation by the federal government a good thing?
I think that we need regulatory clarity more than we need more regulation at this point. There's an incredible amount of regulation around the Bitcoin space, the crypto space broadly. what we need now is simply just clarity and to remove regulation through enforcement is a bad problem that we've been having on the federal side of things. I don't think we necessarily need more regulation. Some people would disagree. I think we need more clarity. With regards to the Biden executive order, I mean, it really just comes down to how aggressive they want to be going into the elections. They want to be aggressive. And the people that are trying to ensure that it doesn't get too aggressive are losing the battle. But the only thing that's stopping them from losing the battle or helping them, preventing them from losing the battle is really the elections and the fact that, you know, if they come down too hard on this industry, it could turn against them in the midterms. And it already has to some extent kind of slightly turned against them. So we'll see. I think it was smart of them. The EO was probably about as good as we could have hoped it would be. It could have been a lot worse from the conversations that I've had with people. Could have been much worse. That being said, you know, we don't want to be living in a mindset where we just accept what's given to us. Like, oh, it was great. We should just, you know, we should take our foot off the gas pedal. Like, we need to continue to apply pressure and continue moving in the right direction. I'm not hopeful for the Biden administration's EO, the reports that they do on it, and what comes from that. Because all this talk about the energy conversation, I think, is a mask for, you know, saying we need to start controlling this industry. The people that I talk to that are in the Biden administration, it's more about control, less about the environment, but they'll use the environment as a tool to gain control potentially. Did you want to comment on that, Biden EO?
No, I mean, I agree with that. And just in general, I mean, my experience at EPA, there's way too many regulations on the books. I think one of the reasons that in the Trump administration we were successful in a lot of ways, including advancing environmental interests while growing the economy, was the 2-for-1 rule that he put in place from day one, which was every new regulation that was on the books had to come alongside cutting to existing regulations. So I just think there's a morass of red tape that gets in the way of a lot of innovations getting out there and being successful, and the way that Bitcoin mining has to deal with that reality. I think Dennis is right. We need more certainty and clarity rather than anything new piled on top of what already exists.
One last thing there is, I don't think they'll do it this time, but my ultimate fear is that they will, the EPA through the Biden administration will regulate the end use of electricity. I mean, we saw that happen in New York, and that's kind of the end game. Like, if you didn't have elections and you had unlimited power and there was no one that could stop you, no reason to not do what you want to do, the end game would be to regulate the end use of electricity, which would say you can't compute SHA-256. Probably they would start with any sort of fossil fuel, just like what New York did. So that would be what they would do if they could do exactly what they wanted to do. But there's other things to consider when it comes to making those decisions. Any other questions?
You guys are amazing. We're going to cut it off there, but
we'll go all day.
Dennis and Mandy are available.
Thank you very much.
They're here. So thank you. Thank you very much.